Welcome back to another episode of Eerie Excursions, the podcast that takes the road less travelled and a left turn into the shadows with me, Amy, a history nerd who loves a good ghost story. Now, I'm no expert, so along our eerie adventure, we'll meet local guides who know all about the spooky legends lurking in their back garden. And watch out, because we might just be down the road from where you are right now. For today's trip, we're back in the Midlands, but this time we're covering a full county, the county of Derbyshire.
There is actually more references to Robin Hood in Derbyshire than there are in Nottinghamshire. And this was just one of them. So that set me to thinking. I thought, why have we got this, as it appears, natural, monumental almost, totally natural structure called Robin Hood's Stride? And so I started to look into it.
You ready to delve into the darkness? Now this week we are doing things a little bit differently, as I said. Today's episode will be from one location, as I'll be honest with you, we don't have the budget to drive around a full county for a day. But our guide does suggest a road trip around Derbyshire you can do for yourself. Now, who is our guide today? So you may recognise him. It is Simon, who you've met during our trip to Nottingham. And if you haven't listened to that episode, I'd highly recommend it. Simon runs a website all about Derbyshire and the Peak District folklore, links to which can be found in the show notes below. So I asked him how he delved into Derbyshire's folklore.
My interest in folklore goes back to my childhood, really, when I first started hearing the stories at school, in those days when school teachers actually told you stories about Viking mythology and things like that, and it really, really enchanted me. So throughout my formative years, I had a real interest in that: myths, legends, folklore, fairy tales, you name it. My interest in folklore specifically came a bit later. I live in Derbyshire, as I said, about 20 minutes drive from the Peak District, which is an internationally renowned national park. It's the most popular national park in the country. And as soon as I sort of started driving, I'd head out into the Peak District and then I'd start walking. And I couldn't tell you exactly when it was, but many years ago I was driving around a new bit of the Peak District which I'd never found before, because we just used to get in the car and drive and see what was there. And I saw what I took to be a castle in the distance. And I thought, I've never heard of a castle being there. So I drove by, and I didn't go to it at this point, but then I later looked it up and found out it wasn't a castle at all. It was a very natural rock formation called Robin Hood's Stride. And I thought, well, that's unusual. We're in Derbyshire. And as I've later found out, there is actually more references to Robin Hood in Derbyshire than there are in Nottinghamshire. And this was just one of them. So that set me to thinking. I thought, why have we got this, as it appears, natural, monumental almost, totally natural structure called Robin Hood's Stride? And so I started to look into it. And one of the old legends of it goes that one day Robin Hood and Little John, who is definitely a Derbyshireman, Little John of Hathersage, were having an archery competition. And they were at a village called Ashover, which is about, I'm going to hazard about 6 miles as the crow flies, a bit further by road, from Robin Hood's Stride. And they were having an archery competition to see who could fire an arrow the furthest. And Robin Hood won, as you would expect, and he planted his arrow right between the two turrets, natural stone turrets of Robin Hood's Stride, and it earned that name from then on. And that, as I say, I couldn't tell you exactly when it happened. It wasn't long after I started driving, so we are 30, 40 years ago, no doubt. That started my interest in folklore. And really what it was about for me back then was gaining a deeper understanding of where you were. If you think about, say, American Indians or the Aborigines of Australia, when they go through their landscape, they have names and stories for everywhere. For example, the Aborigines probably more so, because they will walk miles and miles and miles without any kind of map, and that's because their landscape has a story. So there will be a story that they have learned which allows them to recognise a particular place or landmark, and that's how they find their way across the land. And I was enchanted by this idea, and it really made me think that once upon a time we thought like that. We didn't have, for example, in Derbyshire, the A6 or the A52 or the A515 to name three main roads that run through it. They were there in some primitive form, but we didn't just call them that. It wasn't just, oh, it's the A6. They had names, and as you passed along them, you would have had landmarks that you would have learnt of in story, or you might come across it and somebody tells you a story and you pass that on, and all of a sudden this folklore allows your landscape to become almost a living, breathing, sentient thing with the folkloric history that it's picked up.
So where is Derbyshire? Well, firstly, it's an incredibly long county. It touches the northwest, sitting next to Greater Manchester and Cheshire, and to its east sits Yorkshire and Nottinghamshire. Hence why you find some legends of Robin Hood here as well. Now, like Simon said, it's home to the Peak District, which also spans Staffordshire, Cheshire, South and West Yorkshire and Greater Manchester. For those who haven't been to the Peaks, picture rolling hills, quaint countryside villages, and in fact, in one of those villages, the cherry bakewell was invented. Basically, it's your classic English countryside. The grass is lush and green, and the buildings are old and beautiful. Now, I will warn you, for anyone wanting to hear about hauntings, we'll not be getting that in today's episode. No, today we'll be taking a leisurely drive in the countryside, hearing about the folklore of this beautiful county. Mind you, though, there will be a couple of stories of witches and even a werewolf, so still a little bit eerie.
If you were coming, let us say, north to south, perhaps, and you can motor this if you want, you will discover that actually, top to bottom, Derbyshire is a very long county. I think it's something like 60 miles top to bottom. So, if you want to drive it, it's going to take you a few days if you're going to drop off everywhere. But I would probably start in Longdendale. Longdendale is a long valley. Its nearest sort of town is Glossop, which is at one end of it, which is a lovely little English Derbyshire market town. And there is a Victorian book, which is the Legends of Longdale, which has a lovely amount of stuff in there. It's one of the most interesting things from there is the Longdendale werewolf. Now, werewolves are very, very rare in England or in the UK at all. Obviously they're rare worldwide, I suppose, particularly if you don't believe in them. and I've done some research into why this might be. Now, we do have a lot of black dog legends in English folklore all over the place, and there's a few more of them around Derbyshire, perhaps not as much as Norfolk, which seems to be a centre for them, but I've put a number on the website of the black dog legends. But one of the reasons that we think we don't have very many werewolf legends in the UK is because we killed all the wolves years ago. So whereas in continental Europe the wolves never went away and werewolf stories hence proliferated, in England sadly we killed them all off. So that's probably why we don't have many. In fact, to my knowledge, there are only 3 werewolf legends in England, one of which is in Derbyshire on the Longdendale Valley. And this is a story which comes from the time of King Henry II, probably one of our most powerful medieval kings. He was the father of Richard the Lionheart, who's definitely better known than perhaps his father, and he was succeeded by King John the Cruel, nasty King John who everybody knows about. But it comes from his day, and the king was hunting in the forests of Longdendale, and his son, who it was actually his first son, who actually died before he could ascend to the monarchy and become king, he was hunting, and there was a witch at large in the forests of Longdendale, and she was a classic evil witch. She knew many black arts, and one of those arts was changing shape. She was a shapeshifter, and she one day changed to a wolf, so she became essentially a werewolf. Now at the same time, the bishop of the area was holding his council in the Longdendale Valley, and one of his parishioners complained about how this witch had killed her husband and her sons and blighted her lands, and that she was a shapeshifter. And so the bishop cursed the witch. She was not there, but he cursed her that she must stay in the form she was currently in, whatever that may be. As it happened, it turned out that she was at the time a wolf, as I said, and she tried to kill Henry II's son during the hunt, but he was saved by one of the other noblemen there. So when they killed her in this wolf form, she let out a cry which was like that of an old woman, according to the historical records, and she was basically slaughtered and skinned alive, and that was the only recording of a werewolf in Derbyshire. Now, if we come down from, let's say we should drive off Longdendale and come to the village of Glossop, and then from Glossop you can catch the road called Snake Pass. There is rumoured to be a number of snakes in the forest on either side. There are even some places named after that snake wood, I believe. But a lot of people tend to believe it's called Snake Pass because it's very sinuous, regularly gets cut off during the winter, and becomes impassable. And if you come down from there, you'll be in the Hope Valley. And you have a couple of choices. You've got Hathersage, which is a mine of folklore. It's most famous for being the birthplace of Little John, of Robin Hood fame. And the story has it that Little John, obviously Robin Hood's right-hand man, after Robin died, he wandered the lands for quite some time, and eventually decided that he would go back to Hathersage, from whence he came. And in his wanderings, so the legends sort of vary. Some say that he had a vision, some say it was in a dream, some say he was told, but he was told, if you go back to Hathersage, if you enter the churchyard there, you'll be dead in 3 days. So Little John thought, well, that's easy enough, I just won't go into the churchyard. Anyway, as he came off the moors around Hathersage, which themselves are rich with folklore, There's also a Robin Hood's cave up there as well, which is amazing. As I say, more Robin Hoods in Derbyshire than Nottinghamshire. And as he came down to the village of his birth, a great fog came down. But he knew his way and he carried on. And as the fog cleared, lo and behold, he found himself in the churchyard. And he knew that his time was short. So he finished off his last few days in the village of his birth, and he was buried in Hathersage churchyard. And in Hathersage churchyard there is the grave of Little John. And some centuries ago he was exhumed, and they did in fact find the skeleton in there. They reckoned was at least 8 foot tall.
Oh wow.
They did find the actual physical remains. So this is, yes, it's folklore, but it's coming from some level of fact or truth, if you will. So he was dug up. It also said he left his bow and his cap in the chancel in the church, but that was moved on to a house nearby, and unfortunately that was lost to time. And then if you go back down the Hope Valley, there is the wonderful little village of Hope, but you've got Castleton. There are 2 hills above Castleton, Win Hill and Lose Hill, where it was rumoured that a fight between the Saxon forces of Mercia and the Saxon forces of Northumbria met. And on Lose Hill, the Mercians gathered, who far outnumbered the Northumbrians, and on Win Hill, the Northumbrians gathered. And they basically came down the hill to face each other, and the Northumbrians were a little bit more tricksy, and as they raced up the hill they had a load of rocks ready and they rolled them down and slaughtered the Mercian armies. So that's why you have Win Hill and Lose Hill over Caston on the Great Ridge, along which you'll get to Mantor and a number of the other peaks around there.
Before we move on to any stories, I have to ask, have there been any ghostly sightings either of the werewolf, Little John, or anything on Win and Lose
Hill? There are no ghostly sightings of any of them that I'm aware of. There are many ghost stories throughout Derbyshire, as there are in most counties, but the historians will have it that the Battle of Win Hill and Lose Hill never actually occurred. It is a figment of somebody's imagination. But even if that is the case, which I'm sure they know about these things, it's not really the point. Folklore is not meant to be fact. Folklore is a way of remembering. Now, I imagine that if I were to point out Win Hill and Lose Hills to you in Castleton, and a few years later, you might well have forgotten those names. But if I pointed them out to you and told you the story of them, you would remember. And that's what folklore is essentially about. It doesn't have to be real. For example, one of the most popular walks in Derbyshire, in the Peak District, very close to Buxton, is the Dragon's Back. And if you stand in the village quite close to it, I forget the name now, I think it might be Crowley Kirk, can't quite remember. But if you look at it from the side, it's a dragon. There's the Dragon's Back, it's laying down and it comes down. Its actual name is Crome Hill, is another name for it. It comes down, and then very, very shortly there's another slightly smaller hill, which is like the dragon's head. So it's very much like a recumbent dragon, which the whole thing is called the Dragon's Back. Now you may believe it's actually a dragon that's been there for many millennia and has had the earth grow over it, or you may not. But the thing is, it's the Dragon's Back. It'll always be known as the Dragon's Back, and that's how people will remember it.
Very nice. Lovely. So then back to our little trip.
Back to our tour. Okay, if I were coming back from Castleton, I think I would have to come back. Maybe I'd go a little bit into Buxton and turn around and come back down the A6, as I say. And I will find myself at Ashford in the Water. And just up from Ashford in the Water is one of the most stunning views in the Peak District, which is Monsaldale. You can go to Monsall Head. It's very easy to park the car up there, and it's a beautiful place to walk. It's full of history, folklore, and mythology. On the top of Monsall Head, there's an old Iron Age encampment called Finn Cop, and Finn Cop has had a lot of archaeology done to it because they discovered that, very unusually, it met a very, very violent end. There was some kind of real wholesale slaughter went on there. Obviously, the only evidence they've got of this is archaeological, so they don't really know why. Why would this have happened here? Celtic settlement in the Peak District was not huge, because during the Iron Age, when most of the Celtic activity went on, the climate was not so good, so it would be quite harsh up there. So, Celtic activity is quite rare, but to have this massive slaughter go on there is very, very unusual. So we don't know why that happened, but clearly it was significant. But there is a beautiful legend there, and it's a tragedy. And it's commonly known as the story of Hullock, Warren and Hedessa. And they're both, again, that's unusual. Of those names, Hullock has no history at all. To me, sounds Saxon. The AC on the end etymologically sounds a bit Saxon. Hedessa doesn't exist before that, although some scholars have suggested that it's actually a corruption of a biblical name, Hadasha, who was the Queen of Persia, I think, who sacrificed a lot for her country. She was very beautiful and very virtuous, so they think, it could have been a play on that. The only word that we do know is Hullock's surname, Warren. Now, there were the De Warren family who came over with William the Conqueror, but they had no holdings in Derbyshire, so it's unlikely it would relate to them. But the surname Warren is a trade name associated with people who looked after sort of game. We have rabbit warrens. The Normans brought over rabbits with them. We didn't have them before the Normans. We had hares, but we didn't have rabbits. So, rabbit warrens would be built, because of a good source of food and whatever. So it could be attached to that. But that just makes it all the more difficult to say, where did this story come from? So anyway, the story goes that Hedessa was a shepherdess. She was beautiful, she was kind, she was virtuous. Hullock was anything but. He was said to be a giant of a man. Some stories even have him as a giant. And he desired Hedessa. And so one day he followed her and he tried to press himself upon her. He essentially, in the stories, he attempted to rape her. Hedessa called out for help from the gods and the spirits of the place and ended up flinging herself, or rather the stories would intimate that gods flung her off the side of Monsall Down, and she fell down into the waters of the River Wye, which run through the bottom of the valley. And from where she landed, springs sprung up and fed the Wye even more with the purest of waters, and those springs are still there. Hullock was absolutely enraged, and he wandered around the place, storming back, and he cursed the gods and the spirits, and they dragged him into the waters of the River Wye, and they turned him to stone. And there's a great stone in the middle of the River Wye called the Warren Stone. And it's even recorded that travellers in years gone by would cross the road to avoid it. Now, what's really interesting about this story, to my mind, my experience, it has ancient roots. The names, first of all, are old. They're old enough that they're not really recorded as to why they are that. Also, we have Hullock as the giant. Now, on the side of Monsaldale, there is a natural rock formation. Has a number of names. It's called Hobshurst House or Hobthurst Hole, and we've got a few of these around Derbyshire and further abroad. And a Hob's house, a hob is like it can be a goblin, it can be a giant, some kind of fairy creature. Not always bad. And a hearst means a forest, so it's basically, if let's call it a goblin's house in the wood, and we've got quite a few of them in Derbyshire. There's one literally on the opposite side of the road over on Deepdale, Hobshurst House again. That is a cave. We've got one on the Chatsworth Estate, and that's a very rare rectangular burial mound, which also has this name. But the thing is, what's very, very interesting, you will find in the UK that we have a lot of stories involving the devil. And if we trace those stories back, they started out life as not being the devil, but being a giant. And as we became more Christianised, rather than having it as a giant, we started calling them the devil. Now, this story is old enough that it's still referred to as a giant, not the devil. Secondly, which is really unusual, Hadessa calls out for the help of the gods, plural, and spirits. You would never get that in anything sort of medieval or beyond, because it wasn't Christian. You wouldn't do that. So the fact that we still have a giant involved, we have archaic names, and we have gods and spirits of place called upon, and also that we had a major Iron Age fort there, that tells me that story is very, very old indeed. Again, it's a mystery, and I don't need to ever know the truth of it. I love the fact that it's a mystery.
Yeah, I agree. But it's amazing that it's endured through all of the Christianization of the country. You would have thought somebody would have been like, no, let's make a Christian version of this story. It's crazy that it still retained its very...
Well, yeah, and I think you've got to bear in mind as well, remote places like the Peak District, Christianity would have come to them a bit later than the South. And also, it wasn't like one day we're all pagan Saxons and the next day we're Christians. The transition would have taken centuries, really. And also, beliefs, particularly in rural areas, die very, very hard and sometimes don't die at all. One of the great folkloric things about Derbyshire is the well dressings, which have a veneer of Christianity over them today, but they are ancient. They can easily be traced back to Christian worship of the female figure Mary, and the veneration of wells and water sources is really millennia old. The Celts were doing it. The Romans continued it. When they set up Bath, and Buxton, which of course is a spa town, still has its baths, which the Romans took advantage of. So that kind of thing, it's solid, it's inbuilt into the landscape, and no matter what religion you've got, you don't wipe that out. Okay then, well, if we're at Ashford in the Water, then the next town along is Bakewell. Bakewell is hugely popular with tourists. It's right at the centre of the Peak District. So it's such a great base to go and visit everything else. It has a lot of rich history. That's all. It's also sitting on the River Wye, which is wending its way. It's come down only a couple of miles from Ashford in the Water. And the River Wye will carry on along that valley through Bakewell. Eventually it will join the River Derwent. Now, if we are to stop at Bakewell, one of the most remarkable stories there is the Bakewell Witches, And again, this is an old story. It's probably one of the most well-known stories in the area, and it is supposed to be true, at least some parts of it. And to put it in a nutshell, there was a couple of sisters who were milliners, that's hat makers, who lived in Bakewell, and to supplement their income, they ran their home as a lodging house. Now, one day, a Scotsman, a peddler who was travelling from Scotland down to London, he stopped there. He got a room with the sisters, and all seemed well. However, a few days later, the Scotsman was arrested for vagrancy in London. Now, that's a big leap, a few days later. But what happened next was truly remarkable. Bear in mind, this story is set in the times of King James, who was a very religious man. He could be described as extremely paranoid when it came to witchcraft and demons. He actually wrote a book, Demonology, that he published about all the different demons that you might expect to meet in your life. So he was certainly obsessed with this. But anyway, so that gives you an idea of the backdrop of the era. We're quite on the beginning of the witch hunts and the witch persecutions and Matthew Hopkins. So you get this idea that there is a countrywide, well, Europe-wide paranoia about witches. Anyway, as I said, the Scotsman, after stopping at the milliner's cottage in Bakewell, was arrested for vagrancy in London. When he was thrown in front of the magistrate, he came up with this absolutely outlandish story. And what it was, he said that he'd been stopping at the cottage and he was upstairs in his room and he was woken by some chanting. And he got out of bed and he looked through the floorboards because he could see light coming up from the living room below, and he saw the two sisters, the milliners, were dressed as if ready to go on a trip. And he heard them chanting and he heard what they were chanting, and all of a sudden there was a blinding flash of light and they disappeared. So the Scotsman repeated the chant and there was a blinding flash of light, and he appeared on his own in a cellar in London. And he was obviously very, very frightened. He didn't know what had gone off. And then before too long, the sisters came back. And obviously they were very shocked to find him there. And they got a bunch of silks and satins and cloths and things with them. And they saw the Scotsman there, who they weren't expecting. So they said, "Oh dear, look what's happened to you here, have a glass of wine." So they gave him a glass of wine. He fell unconscious because obviously the wine was tampered with, and he woke up and the sisters had gone. And this was the story he told the magistrate, and the magistrate believed him. He had officers sent to Bakewell, and they raided the milliner's house, and sure enough they found all these silks and satins, but they were milliners, so you would expect them to have that anyway. And the sisters were arrested, they were charged with witchcraft, and they were hung by the neck until death.
I hope you've enjoyed our road trip around Derbyshire. As always, these are places you can visit for yourself, and if you want to read more of Simon's stories, head to his website, Derbyshire Folklore, links to which can be found below. And if you do find yourself in the village of Longdendale, keep an eye out for any big dogs or even wolves. You never know, they might actually be a witch in disguise. That's it for now, but you can also follow us on Instagram at Eerie Excursions. And to be sure you don't miss out on an excursion, subscribe to the YouTube channel below. For our next adventure, we'll be a little bit further up north, in Lancaster.
In this corner, if you think about the numbers of people that were hung, it's very hard to know a specific number, but it's in the hundreds. And right here, their souls left this earth. So if you ever come up at the dead of night, there really is a particular strange atmosphere. If you stand just listening to the wind in the trees that surround the castle, there's like there's an energy to this area.
See you next time for another venture into the darkness.